Hello, BookTube. Welcome to the inaugural episode of 2 If by Sea. This is a joint year-long project between myself and Steve Donahue, where we read books of the sea. And each month, we're going to be reading one fiction and non-fiction book, alternating between the two of us. So this month I read a non-fiction book, and Steve has read a fictional work. And I start out this month with a book by the famous actor Sterling Hayden. And it's a memoir about his time at sea. It's actually a memoir about his life up until the time he wrote it. And it's called Wanderer. And he also wrote a rather famous novel called Voyage. So I'm going to read you a little bit here about him. Many of you will recognize him if you're of a certain age, and many of you won't. But his fame rivaled that of the biggest stars of today, and it informs this story of the sea. So Sterling Hayden was born in 1916, and he died in 1986. So he would be about 70 years old. He was an American author and actor, a leading man for most of his career. He specialized in Western and film noir throughout the 1950s in films like John Huston's Asphalt Jungle, Nicholas Ray's Johnny Guitar, and Stanley Kubrick's The Killing, which came out in 1956. He became noted for supporting roles in the 60s, perhaps most memorably, as General Jack D. Ripper in Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. That came out in 1964. And he was also successful in what they call the New Hollywood era, with roles such as Irish-American policeman Captain McCluskey in Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather, alcoholic novelist Roger Wade in Robert Altman's The Long Goodbye, and elderly peasant Leo Dalco in Bernard Bertolucci's 1900. With a distinctive rapid-fire baritone voice and standing 6'4", he had a commanding screen presence in both leading and supporting roles. And all that's true. But he also had a commanding presence throughout his life, physically, and was an incredibly charismatic man, with all that comes with that, good and bad. And the book I read here, you can see I've got all these things marked here so I can bring some things to your attention and remind myself, obviously. That's him. And he, big man, picked him out in a crowd wherever he walked, and he was like that since he was a little boy. But, like myself, he went to sea when he got a little older. So, you can find YouTube clips of him. I'm filming this at work today because I am on a string of 12-hour days, and tonight's a trustees meeting. So hopefully I can get this filmed, and my wife will upload it for me and do any notes or anything we need to take. So Hayden was born in New Jersey. He's always thought of as a New Englander, but he actually was born in New Jersey. And this story starts there. The book's a little odd, memoir-wise, because he, throughout, will refer to himself in the third person. And there's a reason for that. He has a sickly father, lovely mom. They live in a very nice house in a middle-class neighborhood, and he's always in trouble because his father doesn't live up to his expectations. He's a very romantic child, in the sense that he's a dreamer. And his father is very ill and doesn't live up to that John Wayne type of image that was so prevalent back in the 1930s, 1920s. And But they live a comfortable life. And then his dad dies. There's things in here where the child, Sterling Hayden, feels guilty about that. But his dad, who'd always been sickly, dies, and the family's sort of into chaos, the family being the boy and the mom. And eventually the mom marries a ne'er-do-well, a man who's always got a scheme and never works. The mom works constantly. The house is lost to the man's schemes. The family's thrown into chaos and travels. Basically lives out of a fancy car that they can't afford. Always ahead of bill collectors and staying in fancy hotels and sneaking out at night to get away so they don't have to pay the bill. And they worked their way into New England and bilk a couple of older ladies out of their money with a scheme to build a hotel. It's constantly like this. And then eventually they come to roost in a little island home in Maine. And then that's when Sterling Hayden's pure raw love of the sea begins. He'd been reading earlier, and his life, you'll notice in this book, is wrapped in the sea, wrapped in books, wrapped in public libraries. They become a refuge for him. And in this great arc of his life, this becomes his ideal, this island. And he gets a little sailboat. He's a tow-headed kid, big, lanky kid that everybody notices, and he doesn't know he's always noticed. The image of him is sailing out of the harbor, holding on to the line of the sail, his foot on the tiller, steering, standing up, looking at sea. And that becomes his image, and it's an accurate one. He's a born sailor, unbelievably talented. And then he's always the outsider. Goes to the library, sort of makes friends. And I'm going to read you some passages here that I think will give you the idea. But if I was to describe this book in any way, it would be, this is the beginning of beatnik life, hippie life, resistance. It starts in the Depression. It starts when middle-class white families were broken by the finances of the time, the cultural breakdown, the social breakdown, were thrown into a world where they worked with classes and ethnicities that they'd never done before. And they came in contact with those people and learned that they weren't different, and learned that they could all struggle against a common enemy, which is the wealthy. And that swirling around, in my opinion, and then you add, of course, World War II, where women went to work, and that's when the social changes in America really started picking up steam. And you'll see it in this life. Now, he, throughout this book, if you're sensitive, he's calling every ethnicity by their most derogatory term. If you read it like that, you're missing the point of this book. He calls each group by what they were commonly called in the day, which to us is totally offensive, as it should be. But to him, it's a sign of identification. They're like him. His friends are those people. They're not the wealthy white people. His problem and his struggle was, because of his looks, his charismatic nature, one day he could be hobnobbing on Beacon Hill, and the next day he's down scrubbing the deck of a ship, or washing dishes, or scraping paint. He lives in both worlds in an odd, strange way, and it does give you perspective of what that world and how horribly brutal it must have been like. But his enemy, the people he doesn't like, and it impacts his life immensely, are the wealthy. He does not like them. And he worships work. He worships the identity of being a sailor, which wasn't, well, it had its romantic parts. It did have all that, but he's a sailor with work boots. He's not a yachtsman. So I'm going to read you a little bit of what I thought I'd bring to the fore here out of this book. This is an old book, so a little of the blurb is: a superb piece of writing, literate and literary, rebellious and beatnik. Echoes from Poe to Melville to Steinbeck and Mailer. I think that's true. I would add Kerouac. I would add a few more to that. But here's some of what I read. So he's on his way. This is his relationship with books and the sea. Books and the sea, I discovered, had more than a little in common. Both were distilled of silence and solitude. Silence and solitude. Books and the sea. Sail oft in library. World enough for any man. Yet how few of them knew it. There were 6 garages sprawled about Boothbay, he's in Maine, and they were crowded all day long and half the night as well. There were 2 drugstores, and both were jammed afternoon and evening. The more popular of the 2 had a rental library as well, made up of cheap fiction for the most part, with gaudy jacketed books displayed between shelves of deodorant and gargle, not far from the soda fountain. Then further on, he's in the library now. We came to a section marked 910.4, Voyages and Voyaging. I watched her leave. Then everyday world dissolved in a sky full of clouds, and each book was a book of the sea and ships. They marched through my mind for hours that day as I thumbed them one by one. When I left, it was nearly dark and my arms were loaded with books. I ran up the sail and flew toward the island, and after supper curled in the window seat with my newfound world. So that's him in the island off the coast of Boothbay, Maine, where they had a little rental house. It was a derelict house, but he found magic in the library. And then this is interesting. I lived a lot of my life in Bangor, Maine, and when I worked at the Bangor Public Library, I worked in the special collections there for a while, and one of my jobs was to provide metadata and to scan and download the history of the Bangor Railroad and the railroad yard and the terminal there that's long gone, destroyed, but it will still be there during Sterling Hayden's time. And a beautiful building destroyed for in the name of progress. But if you ever heard the song King of the Road, there's this line in there where destination Bangor, Maine. Bangor was a railroad town as well as a sea town. And sea town in the sense it was on the Penobscot River. And we'll hear more about the Penobscot, but which led to the sea. And so I know the railroad yards. I played there. They were still there when I was a child. I would play on the railroad cars, which sounds odd. It's a different time. And now it's a big park. The rails are gone. It's open fields on the river, on the waterfront. And I remember the old buildings. They're gone. Brick, the cobblestone roads, they're all gone. But here they're not gone. And a diner squats by the highway with steam windows. A truck starts out and I step into the path of its lights. Mister, could you give me a lift to Bangor, please? Please, he says in dismay. Sure, kid, get in. He drives too fast, what with the snow and ice. My window is stuffed with paper, but it still leaks. We're both bundled up, and the small Maine towns flash by. I'm free to roam and laugh and slug my way through the great big roaring world of men. Free to head for the blue lagoons and trade wind seas, to grab a job on a windjammer and learn the sailorman's trade. So I tell myself, patting my wallet with its pictures of Mother and Laird and the island, along with a $2 bill. Debbie, darling, I hope you're waiting for me there, because I'm cold and it's going to be a long haul from Bangor to Portland for a man who's riding the rods, whatever they might be. Bangor sleeps as the clock booms midnight, and I run for the depot. Oh, Debbie, please be there, because you're my girl, and it's not every night you get to meet your boyfriend down at the railroad yards. Oh, Debbie, I just want to pull you inside my arms and in my coat and feel your body, and that's all. Really it is, except maybe for a goodbye kiss. Something to take with me out into the world. The wail of the whistle haunts the river valley. and that's Bangor. It sits in the river valley. So she doesn't show. And then here's him. The sailing and the writing are the combination for him. So here's the writing. Oops, almost lost my page here. So, write. Blaze away through the pages of a book. Draw from the only thing that you know, the life you hold in your two hands, this life of yours that has gone so far astray from the things originally planned. How many times in the course of the lost decade did you swear yourself in as a writer, safely ensconced in your bedroom office, surrounded by charts and books and inspirational quotations? How many times did you pound out a title page, only to have your mind grow soft and retract within itself while you smoked and paced and cursed, with the sounds of some neighbor's hi-fi barreling through the air? How many pictures did you make without once looking at the script you kept by your side, turned upside down in the tooled leather binder, and script you used as a notebook, filling it with notes addressed to yourself and concerned with this or that sea story you would one day write, you hoped? And wasn't it strange that you never in all that time were able to draw from your own mind? Instead, you adapted stories written by others. You were, it seems, only a plagiarist, an actor pirate, good for melting down other men's thoughts and words. He's a very insecure man. He's big, he's powerful, he does incredibly brave things at sea. And yet, there's this insecurity in him that becomes a theme throughout the book. Somewhere between the flea-bitten hotel off Scully Square and the Boston Fish Pier, he changed his name to Chris. Sterling, for Christ's sakes. Who ever heard of a man with a name like that? Anywhere, let alone in the forecastle of a Gloucesterman. Chris was for Fletcher Christian of the HMS Bounty, patron saint of mutineers and kids cast loose in the dismal 30s in the shores of a world so civilized a man could starve to death in a flop house, while less than a mile away, toy poodles wore matching booties and jackets when they were taken riding by the chauffeur. This is that class warfare that's going on. I thought I'd show you some photos. We're going to get to the ship Wanderer, the schooner that he ends up taking and defying a court order. Him and his children left Hollywood. When he became that famous actor, he was never happy. He never felt like he was working. And his image is not only as a sailor and a working class man that was designed and formed and created during the Depression. Here he is. He despised Hollywood, despised L.A., liked San Francisco, but he despised L.A., and he despised the life. So, let's move on here a little bit. So he's become a sailor that actually has national acclaim as a working sailor. So again, different times. Here's a quote from a newspaper. Sterling Hayden of Gloucester, the first mate, was that rare find, a born sailor, a natural. This is the greatest quality a man can hope to find in the man to whom he will, at times, have to entrust the command of his ship. In addition, he had the ability to assume authority, and apparently that too was innate. He gave orders easily, and they were followed unquestioningly, though most of them under him were older than his 20-year-old mate. And I'm wrong, that wasn't a newspaper quote. That was actually from a book called Sailing to Sea, S-E-E, by Irving Johnson. So he's already made his name as a sailor. He worked in open dories off the Grand Banks as a young man, in violent weather. You can only imagine what that's like. So I mentioned that I had a connection with the geography. I also have a connection with a man who at the time was a very famous man in America, Lincoln Colcord. And I worked creating his finding aid at the archives in this Penobscot Marine Museum in Searsport, Maine. Now, Sterling has just come from a round-the-world trip as a first mate on a sailing vessel. And that vessel picks up Lincoln Colcord, and they're going to drop him off in Searsport, Maine. And Lincoln Colcord was a writer, a political writer, writer of sea stories, a historian of the sea. He was actually born on the ship at sea, as was his sister. So here's where, and I did not know the details of this story, but here's where Lincoln Colcord, and I can't read it all to you because some of it's a little colorful, but I'll read some to you. The stranger hails from there. He stands now with his head thrown back, checking the lead of the gear. His eye runs around on the mainmast head. Then he crosses along to the fore and down again to the bows. He stamps on the deck, and you'd swear he was tempted to smile. His eyes, mouth, and jaws shine with arrogance. The face is sharp, and handsome too, in a jaundiced way, as it befits a man with his background. Born off Cape Horn in his father's full-rigged ship, he has been in turn civil engineer, Washington correspondent, editor of a radical journal, and the author of a dozen novels about the sea. His name is Lincoln Colcord. So here's another part of the scene. They strode through the village together, mate and friend, aged 22 and 55 that July day in 1938. The mate felt pleased, honored really, that he was the only guest of this querulous man who delighted in speaking with ruthless honesty. And then they go to Lincoln's house. And his wife's there, and they have a conversation one would not place in the 1930s, but these were exceptional people. The living room was full of pictures of ships and oil paintings done in Hong Kong, and books everywhere, from ceiling to floor, under and over windows, piled under tables, on top of tables. The mate was awed. This was a home. This is what people mean when they talk about home. Not the houses in the suburbs like we used to have. Not the hotels and the fancy apartments and all that. Just an old white house by the water, feeling its way into the life of a village. And those books of Lincoln Colcord, I worked in the midst of those books for many, many years. So I was thrilled to, here, let me make an aside here. I actually have a book that shows Lincoln Colcord in his home with his books. And like I say, books that I had the privilege of working with. And that's Lincoln right there, and you can see he's a querulous man. And just as for those of you who know who Samuel Eliot Morison was, there's a picture of the two of them sailing. And Samuel Eliot Morison was a historian, and a great one. So, but getting back to our book. Now, Sterling becomes an actor. He's just draws attention everywhere he goes, and finally Hollywood finds out. And this poor kid, sailor man, becomes an actor. And one of the first things he has to do after he does his first movie is ride in a parade. And this just caught my attention for those of you who remember TV and back in the day. We rode toward the end of the cavalcade. I rode next to the cavalcade, next to an unknown starlet, with our unknown names on a placard. Roy and Dale were up in front, dressed like sugar plum buckaroos, waving and prancing, and Trigger went all the way from Gower Gulch to Grauman's Chinese Theater without disgracing his name. So if you put a working cowboy next to Sterling Hayden, he'd have respect, but sugar plum buckaroos didn't do it for him. And this becomes a problem while he's in Hollywood. And then, and his friends, just from his sailing days and his working in fishing trade and all that, are always around, always in the background. O'Toole comes in with a bottle of bourbon. I draw the drapes and peer out at Copley Square, where the pigeons hump around on the snow and the public library looms dark and just as forbidding as it did 8 years ago, when I used to sit with the unemployed battalion in the great vault of the reading room, hushed and full of the stale, sick smell. So libraries, always books, always these images of the sea. So then the war, World War II, shows up, not unexpectedly. So he talks about himself in the third person sometimes, and if you read the volume, the memoirs, you'll understand why, because he's showing the unreality, the facade of his life. His big break came in March when he parachuted for the 11th time from the belly of a Sterling bomber. But this time he landed in a quarry, breaking his ankle, tearing a cartilage loose in the knee, and injuring the base of his spine. They patched him up, gave him crutches that were much too short, and sent him to Liverpool, where he boarded a fast Norwegian freighter bound for New York City. He smiled to himself as he smelled the river and felt it underneath him and saw the barrage of balloons strung down by the battery Mercy. Excuse me. He volunteered and went over to Europe prior to America's involvement in the war to train with commandos. Eventually, he would work with Wild Bill Donovan as a commando and agent himself in the war. When did the fear set in? Isn't it true that I've been living a lie for years? Wasn't I a forecastle dweller who is not a forecastle dweller, a student who is not a student, a doryman unlike any other doryman, a fireman in effect but not in fact, a kid on the road who never was on the road at all? When is an unemployed victim of the Depression not a victim at all? Perhaps when his life is a charade. When is an actor not an actor? When the bulk of his acting is done off stage. But God in hand, how did it all start? Well, it started when he was a child. And he ends up going into to Yugoslavia and fighting with the communists against the Nazis. And his exploits are legendary. At birth, he stood 6'5" in his leather jumping boots and weighed close to 230 pounds. A British parachute emblem and a small American flag were neatly stitched on the sleeve of his combat jacket. There were also the conventional military insignia, a .357 and Magnum revolver strapped to his leg. His name was John Hamilton. He was a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. Well, he had changed his name, taken on a pseudonym to get into the military in the first place. And he would never admit that he was this actor. And he wasn't quite as famous as an actor then. So 3 days after Hamilton's arrival, Sterling Hayden, he's put in charge of establishing a new partisan base of operations in the quaint old port of Monopoli, some 30 miles south of Bari. He had 400 Yugoslavs, 50 of them girls, and a fleet of 14 schooners, 6 ketches, and 2 brigantines, all of them more or less equipped with auxiliary power. To these ships fell a task of running the German blockade across the Adriatic to the partisan islands of Vis off the coast of German-held Dalmatia. Their average cruising speeds was 7 knots. And I know this is running a little long. And I knew there was more sea here than in all the ships afloat, because he's talking about Lincoln Colcord's house again. He's revisiting after the war, and he's in Searsport, Maine. I knew there was more sea here than all the ships afloat. Maybe that's the way it had always been. Romance went with the dreams. He's self-aware, and he's understanding, and he mentions this image of New England, this image of the sea, ships. He goes, perhaps the only enemy New England knows is change. And sitting here in a library in New England, I can tell you there's some truth in that. And he makes a mistake. He comes back from the war, and he's still the idealistic, romantic man he's always been. And he sees the injustice of the world. Don't forget he grew up in the Depression. And he's got a lot of money. He's back in Hollywood, and he says to himself, but I wonder whether there's ever before been a man who bought a schooner and joined the Communist Party all on the same day. And he did, and it was almost his downfall. Because he got caught up by McCarthy's commission. He was nearly destroyed. He did give names of people that he knew the commission already had. The right-wingers proclaimed him a hero, and he never got over it because he was the opposite of that. And this is a complex thing that I can't get into in great detail here, but he spent the rest of his life dealing with that. And then finally, there's a scene in the end here that I won't get into in great detail where he very nearly becomes the ultimate thing that is the opposite of what he is in real life. And that is the character Tarzan. And how he walks out, they desperately wanted him to play Tarzan. And he walked out and walked away from it. And the marriages, and the booze, and the just harsh life from the Depression. This book is a great book. I know if you like Kerouac, if you like Hemingway, you like all that, but it has a different side to it. A side to it that is pretty tough to read. But it's a fantastic book. I know this went on for a half hour. I hope all these don't go on for a half hour. I couldn't cover a millionth of this thing. And I cannot tell you how much I fell into this world and how much I read this. Some of it I knew, but this is a good book, and I hope if you find it, it's been reprinted. Find it in this old beat up copy, a copy like this big old hardbound, because this packaging matches this story. So thank you. This is the first episode of 2If by Sea, and it went on for a half hour, and I apologize for that. And if you make it all the way through, bless you. So thank you.